One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Foreword. The dramatic story of the first Soviet publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich has often been told. The most authoritative account, and by far the most stimulating one, is by Solzhenitsyn himself, who relates in The Oak and the Calf how a unique confluence of political and psychological circumstances made possible the appearance of One Day on the pages of Novy Mir in 1962. But non-specialist readers are less likely to be aware of the fact that the text published in the Soviet Literary Journal does not represent the canonical version of One Day. Some of the differences are due to ideologically determined omissions and modifications introduced at the urging of Novy Mir's editorial board. Much more significant changes were made by the author himself, even before he submitted his manuscript to the journal. Such a process is referred to as self-censorship. In the case of Solzhenitsyn, it entailed smoothing over and trimming back passages which in his opinion would never get by the censors. It is important to recall the political atmosphere prevailing in the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. Even though Nikita Khrushchev had launched a campaign to discredit Stalin some years earlier, the legacy of the past was still all too obvious in virtually every sphere of life. In particular, literature operated within a clearly defined framework of restrictions that curtailed any truthful discussion of the central events that had shaped Soviet history. Topics considered highly sensitive included the violent implementation of the collective farm system, the imprisonment or deportation of vast numbers of people by virtue of their social class, nationality, religion, or other factors suggesting potential disloyalty, the various policies in effect during the war with Nazi Germany, and the very existence of the vast network of prison camps that underpinned the entire Soviet economic system. The 1962 publication of One Day made history by breaking each of these taboos. Nevertheless, the text printed at the time, and it must be noted that it served as the basis for all earlier English translations, offered deliberately muted versions of some themes that are made explicit for the first time in the present translation. A few examples will suffice. When we hear the story of Shukhov's gang leader, Turin, who had been arrested and sentenced to hard labor simply for being a son of a gulag, we now get a better understanding of the scope of the campaign unleashed against the peasants during collectivization. Neither women nor children were spared, and villages were terrorized by communist fanatics. Whereas we knew before that Shukhov was in prison camp because he had signed a document to the effect that he was a German spy, he had been captured by the Germans but had escaped, we now learn the brutally simple reason for his confession. He had been beaten senseless by Soviet counterintelligence officers, and signing was the only way to save his life. Other details restored in the canonical text include the information that Baptists were sentenced to 25 years for their faith alone, and that the same type of punishment could be expected for even the briefest association with foreigners. Senka Klevshin's crime consisted of being liberated from Buchenwald by Americans. The full text of One Day offered here is not structurally different from the versions published earlier. It is more a question of dotting political I's and crossing historical T's. But in the present instance, we have the additional factor of a masterful new translation by Harry Willits. Rendering Solzhenitsyn's prose into English is always a formidable task, but dealing with the intricate stylistic nuances of One Day presents difficulties of a particularly high order. Although the work is not technically a first-person narrative, the greater part of the text is nevertheless expressed in the idiom of the main protagonist, a man of peasant origin and no formal education. To achieve this effect, Solzhenitsyn